Empires are not just lines on a map or stories from dusty old history books. They are living legacies that continue to shape the world we live in today. Few rivalries have been as enduring, complex, and impactful as that between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. For centuries, these two mighty powers clashed on battlefields, negotiated across ornate tables, and influenced the cultures, religions, and borders of entire regions. Their intertwined stories are filled with drama, diplomacy, and lessons that still echo in the modern age. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will dive deep into the captivating legacy of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. From fierce conflicts and strategic alliances to cultural exchanges and shared challenges, we'll explore how these empires not only fought each other, but also shaped each other and the world around them. Stay tuned as we journey through centuries of history to uncover the truths, myths, and lasting impact of this imperial rivalry. The Habsburg and Ottoman empires, two of the most formidable powers of early modern Europe, carved their legacies into the fabric of world history through a complex relationship of rivalry, warfare, and occasional diplomacy. Emerging in the late Middle Ages and flourishing well into the modern era, both empires shaped much of Europe's and the Mediterranean's political, cultural, and religious realities. Their dynamic interactions, alternating between fierce confrontation and uneasy cooperation, left lasting effects on global developments that reverberate even today. The origins of both empires were humble. The Habsburgs began as a minor noble family in what is now Switzerland. Through strategic marriages, political alliances, and inheritance, they rose to become rulers of a sprawling European dynasty. The family's motto, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry," reflected their unique method of expanding power without always resorting to military conquest. On the other side, the Ottomans were a Turkish-speaking tribe that emerged on the frontiers of the crumbling Seljuk Sultanate in Anatolia. Their early leaders were skilled warriors and organizers who capitalized on the decline of Byzantium and other local powers. By the late 13th century, under Osman I, the Ottomans began a steady expansion that would transform them into one of the most enduring Islamic empires. As the Ottomans pushed westward, they encountered the Habsburgs, who by the 16th century were the preeminent force in Central Europe. The defining moment of their rivalry came after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which signaled the Ottomans' arrival as a major imperial force. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached its territorial peak, stretching from North Africa through the Middle East and deep into southeastern Europe. Suleiman's campaigns in Hungary, Austria, and the Balkans brought him into direct conflict with the Habsburgs, particularly the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and his successors. The Battle of Mohács in 1526 was a critical turning point. The Ottoman victory over the Hungarian forces led to the partitioning of Hungary between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. This established a frontier that would remain a zone of conflict for centuries. The Habsburgs, despite being weaker militarily in many respects, were relentless in defending their territories. Vienna, their capital, became a symbol of resistance. The sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683 were moments of immense significance. The first was unsuccessful but underscored the might of the Ottoman army. The second, more than a century and a half later, marked the beginning of Ottoman decline and the Habsburg resurgence. However, their rivalry was not merely military. It was also religious, ideological, and civilizational. The Habsburgs were staunch defenders of Catholicism, especially during the Protestant Reformation and the subsequent Counter-Reformation. They saw themselves as protectors of Christendom against the perceived threat of Islam, embodied by the Ottomans. Conversely, the Ottoman sultans, as caliphs of the Islamic world, viewed their wars against Christian powers as part of a broader struggle for religious supremacy. This framing of their conflict gave it a heightened ideological intensity that went beyond politics. Despite these confrontations, the Habsburg-Ottoman relationship was not devoid of diplomacy or cooperation. Periods of truce and treaties punctuated their centuries of warfare. Trade between the empires was robust, particularly through intermediaries like Venice and various Balkan merchants. Prisoners of war were often exchanged, and envoys shuttled between Vienna and Istanbul to negotiate peace terms or clarify boundaries. In some periods, both empires even found common cause in opposing mutual enemies. For instance, during the 30 Years' War, the Ottomans were wary of supporting Protestant states because it might indirectly empower Habsburg enemies who were Catholic but shared certain geopolitical objectives. The Habsburg and Ottoman systems of governance also presented striking contrasts and similarities. The Habsburgs presided over a patchwork of territories with different languages, laws, and traditions. Their power lay more in personal unions and dynastic claims than in centralized bureaucracy. In contrast, the Ottomans developed a more cohesive administrative system based on Islamic principles, but also incorporated local customs and elites through the millet system and the devshirme system. Both empires faced the challenge of managing multi-ethnic, multi-religious populations, and both evolved sophisticated methods to ensure loyalty and order. Culturally, the two empires were vibrant centers of art, architecture, and learning. The Habsburgs patronized music, painting, and the Baroque style, making cities like Vienna and Prague cultural hubs. The Ottomans, drawing from Persian, Arab, and Turkish traditions, developed their own aesthetic with architectural marvels like the Süleymaniye Mosque and the Topkapi Palace. Istanbul became a melting pot of cultures and a center of Islamic scholarship, just as Vienna flourished as a beacon of Catholic learning. One cannot ignore the role that external powers played in the Habsburg-Ottoman dynamic. France, for instance, famously allied with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, a shocking development in a Europe defined by religious animosity. This Franco-Ottoman alliance was pragmatic, rooted in the desire to curb Habsburg hegemony rather than any genuine affinity. Similarly, other powers like Poland, Russia, and the various Italian states all played roles in the shifting balance between the two empires. By the 18th century, the nature of the Habsburg-Ottoman conflict began to change. The Ottomans, having failed to modernize their military and administrative structures adequately, began losing ground. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, implemented reforms under rulers like Maria Theresa and Joseph II that strengthened their state apparatus. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marked the beginning of the Ottoman retreat from Central Europe. The Habsburgs gained significant territories, including most of Hungary and Transylvania, reversing centuries of Ottoman dominance. Yet, even as the Ottomans declined, they retained a symbolic importance. The so-called Eastern Question, in 19th-century European diplomacy, revolved around what to do with the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The Habsburgs, now part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were deeply involved in these deliberations. They feared that the collapse of the Ottomans would destabilize the Balkans, ignite nationalist uprisings, and draw in rival powers like Russia and Britain. Thus, even in decline, the Ottomans remained a critical part of Habsburg strategic thinking. Nationalism was another force that reshaped both empires. In the Balkans, ethnic groups like the Serbs, Bulgarians, and Greeks sought independence from Ottoman rule, inspired in part by liberal and nationalist ideas spreading from Western Europe. Similarly, within the Habsburg realms, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, and others began demanding more autonomy or outright independence. These pressures eroded the internal cohesion of both empires and contributed to their eventual demise. The First World War was the final blow. The Habsburgs and Ottomans found themselves on the same side, allied with Germany. Their reasons were different, but both hoped to preserve their empires in a rapidly changing world. The war, however, proved disastrous. The Habsburg Empire collapsed in 1918, giving rise to new nation-states like Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, after a period of post-war occupation and internal strife, gave way to the Republic of Turkey in 1923 under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Thus ended two imperial traditions that had dominated Eurasia for centuries. Despite their fall, the legacies of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires endure. In Central Europe and the Balkans, political boundaries, cultural institutions, and even cuisines bear the marks of their rule. In Austria and Turkey, the imperial past remains a subject of nostalgia, controversy, and scholarly interest. Historians debate the nature of their rule, the reasons for their decline, and the impact of their centuries-long rivalry. Some view them as oppressive empires that hindered national self-determination. Others emphasize their ability to manage diversity and foster relative stability in volatile regions. In retrospect, the Habsburg-Ottoman relationship defies simple categorization. It was not merely a clash of civilizations, nor was it purely a geopolitical contest. It was a multifaceted interaction shaped by the personalities of rulers, the exigencies of statecraft, and the broader currents of European and Islamic history. Their story is one of rivalry and respect, destruction and creation, resistance and adaptation. Through their entangled histories, we gain insight into the larger processes that have shaped the modern world: empire building, religious conflict, diplomacy, and the enduring quest for power and legitimacy. Understanding the Habsburg-Ottoman dynamic also invites us to reconsider the nature of empires more broadly. Both were deeply hierarchical, yet flexible enough to accommodate different identities and traditions. Both saw themselves as universal and missioned the Habsburgs as defenders of the Catholic faith and the Ottomans as protectors of Islam. Both succeeded for centuries not only because of military might, but because of their ability to project legitimacy, co-opt local elites, and foster economic and cultural life. Their eventual downfall was not inevitable, but the result of internal weaknesses exacerbated by external pressures. Today, as the world grapples with questions of multiculturalism, religious pluralism, and the legacy of imperialism, the histories of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires offer valuable lessons. They show us the possibilities and limits of empire, the fragility of coexistence, and the enduring power of historical memory. The frontier that once divided Vienna from Istanbul is now bridged by trade, migration, and shared history. Yet, the echoes of their old conflicts and accommodations still resonate in politics, in culture, and in the stories we tell about who we are and where we come from. Thus, the tale of the Habsburgs and Ottomans is more than a chronicle of war and diplomacy. It is a window into the making of the modern world, a world shaped by imperial ambition, religious fervor, and the ceaseless human desire to govern and to be free. Their intertwined legacies remind us that history is not made by empires alone, but by the people who live within them, negotiate their contradictions, and carry their stories into the future. The story of the Habsburgs and the Ottomans is one of remarkable transformation, the rise of two sprawling empires from modest beginnings into dominant global powers. Their trajectories separate in origin, but increasingly intertwined through a mixture of warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, shaped the fate of Europe, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia and Africa. These two dynasties, each rooted in a distinct religious and cultural tradition, rose to prominence at roughly the same time. Their eventual collision in the 16th century initiated centuries of contestation that would define regional politics for generations. The Habsburgs began as a relatively insignificant noble family in the Alpine region of present-day Switzerland and Austria. Through political cunning, strategic marriages, and calculated territorial acquisition, they transformed into a dynastic powerhouse. One of the pivotal moments in their ascent was when Rudolf I was elected King of the Romans in 1273, giving the family a foothold in imperial politics. From there, the Habsburgs steadily accumulated lands and titles, particularly in Austria. By the 15th and 16th centuries, their ambitions extended beyond the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. A series of advantageous matrimonial alliances brought them the crowns of Spain, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile laid the foundation of Spanish unification, and their daughter Joanna's marriage to Philip the Handsome of Habsburg merged Spanish and Habsburg interests. Their son, Charles V, would inherit a vast transcontinental empire that stretched from Central Europe to the Americas. The Habsburg strategy was often less about military conquest and more about dynastic diplomacy. They understood the power of inheritance and treaties, leveraging marriages to forge and secure alliances that brought new territories under their rule. The result was a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions ruled under the same dynasty, each with its own local identity, laws, and institutions, but connected through the Habsburg monarchy. By the time Charles V ascended the throne in the early 16th century, he stood at the helm of a political constellation unmatched in European history, presiding over territories in Europe, the Americas, and parts of Africa and Asia. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the Ottomans were undergoing a rapid transformation of their own. Emerging as one of many small Turkic principalities after the fragmentation of the Seljuk Sultanate, the Ottomans quickly distinguished themselves through military effectiveness and flexible governance. Under Osman I, the founder of the dynasty, and his successors, they began expanding westward into Byzantine and Balkan territories. What set them apart was their ability to absorb and integrate diverse populations and traditions, adopting useful aspects of Persian, Arab, and Byzantine systems to build a strong imperial core. By the 15th century, the Ottomans had become a major power. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 by Sultan Mehmed II was not only a major military achievement, but a symbolic victory that marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of Istanbul as a great Islamic capital. With Constantinople as their center, the Ottomans solidified their control over the Balkans, Anatolia, and parts of the Middle East. They developed a centralized administration supported by an efficient military system, including the elite Janissary Corps, and created a state structure that allowed for both religious pluralism and political control. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century marked the high point of Ottoman power and territorial expansion. Under his rule, the empire expanded deep into Eastern Europe, parts of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Suleiman was not only a powerful conqueror, but also a lawgiver who codified Islamic and imperial laws, bringing stability to a vast and diverse population. His campaigns in Europe brought the Ottomans into direct conflict with the Habsburgs, who saw themselves as defenders of Christendom against the advance of Islam. The early encounters between the two empires were shaped by their geographic proximity and mutual ambitions. The Balkans became a contested space, a frontier where imperial power and religious identity collided. The Battle of Mohács in 1526 was a defining moment. The Ottomans, led by Suleiman, decisively defeated the Hungarian forces, killing King Louis II and triggering a succession crisis. The vacuum allowed the Ottomans to occupy much of Hungary, while the Habsburgs, under Ferdinand I, claimed the western part of the kingdom. This led to the division of Hungary into three parts: Royal Hungary under Habsburg control, Central Hungary under direct Ottoman rule, and the Principality of Transylvania, which functioned as an Ottoman vassal. From this point forward, the Habsburgs and Ottomans were locked in a long struggle for dominance in Central Europe. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 marked the first attempt by the Ottomans to take the Habsburg capital. Though the siege failed, it sent shockwaves through Europe and established Vienna as a symbol of Christian resistance. A second, more famous siege would come in 1683, also ending in Ottoman failure, but by then the strategic balance had shifted. This clash was not only a military one, but also a profound ideological confrontation. The Habsburgs were staunchly Catholic, particularly after the onset of the Protestant Reformation, and positioned themselves as the sword of the Catholic Church. The Ottomans, under the caliphate title assumed by the sultans, presented themselves as protectors of Islam and leaders of the Muslim world. Each side portrayed the conflict as a religious crusade, although pragmatic politics often shaped their decisions more than ideology. Despite their fierce rivalry, the two empires engaged in periods of negotiation and coexistence. Numerous treaties were signed to establish temporary peace, fix borders, or exchange prisoners. Trade routes between the empires remained active even during periods of conflict. Merchants, diplomats, and emissaries moved between Vienna and Istanbul, carrying with them goods, ideas, and reports. Venice, an independent power at the time, often served as a mediator and commercial bridge between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The conflict between the Habsburgs and Ottomans also reshaped the internal dynamics of Europe. The constant threat of Ottoman expansion prompted the Habsburgs to centralize power, increase military spending, and seek alliances with other European powers. It influenced papal diplomacy, Protestant-Catholic relations, and the balance of power between Northern and Southern Europe. Conversely, the Ottomans had to adapt to the logistical and financial challenges of maintaining a military presence in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, which were far from their Anatolian heartland. As the 17th century progressed, the Ottoman Empire began to experience military and administrative decline, exacerbated by internal revolts and increasing corruption. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs, under leaders like Leopold I, began to recover and reorganize. The turning point came in 1683 with the Second Siege of Vienna. A coalition of Christian forces, led by the Polish King John III Sobieski, lifted the siege, marking a significant shift in the Habsburgs' favor. The subsequent wars culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which forced the Ottomans to cede large swaths of Hungary and other territories to the Habsburgs. This treaty marked the beginning of Habsburg ascendancy in Central and Southeastern Europe and the retreat of Ottoman influence. For the next century, the Habsburgs consolidated their holdings and implemented administrative reforms. In contrast, the Ottomans faced increasing pressure from rising European powers, nationalist revolts in the Balkans, and the slow erosion of their authority. Yet, the echoes of the earlier conflicts continued to influence both empires. In the 18th and 19th centuries, both powers struggled with the demands of modernization and reform. The Habsburgs instituted limited constitutional changes, tried to balance the competing demands of their multi-ethnic empire, and attempted to industrialize parts of their realm. The Ottomans, through the Tanzimat reforms, tried to modernize the military, bureaucratic, and legal systems, but these changes were met with resistance and came too late to stop the empire's gradual decline. Their fates became intertwined again during the 19th century with the emergence of the Eastern Question. European powers debated how to manage the expected collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Habsburgs, who now ruled a significant portion of the Balkans, feared that Ottoman disintegration would unleash nationalist movements that could threaten their own stability. Paradoxically, they supported the preservation of the Ottoman Empire in some cases, not out of sympathy, but because its presence acted as a buffer against Russian expansion and Slavic nationalism. The final chapter came during the First World War, when both empires, now shadows of their former selves, entered into a doomed alliance with Germany. The war placed immense strains on their already fragile systems. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918, leading to the disintegration of centuries of Habsburg rule and the emergence of new nation-states. The Ottoman Empire followed shortly after. Defeat in war, combined with internal dissent and nationalist uprisings, brought about its end. The Republic of Turkey emerged from the ashes, severing ties with the Ottoman imperial legacy. Despite their collapse, the legacies of both empires remain evident. In cities like Vienna, Budapest, Sarajevo, and Istanbul, the architectural and cultural imprints of both empires coexist. The political geography of Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa still reflects the decisions, borders, and migrations shaped by their rise and rivalry. Language, cuisine, religious identity, and legal traditions in these regions all bear traces of Ottoman and Habsburg influence. Their centuries-long contest was not a simple tale of Christian versus Muslim, or East versus West. It was a multifaceted interaction defined by shifting power dynamics, shared interests, betrayals, alliances, and cultural exchanges. Both empires were at once conservative and adaptive, oppressive and pragmatic. They provide critical insight into how states rise through a combination of ambition, adaptation, and luck, and how they fall under the weight of internal contradictions and external pressures. The rise of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires was more than a chapter in European history. It was a foundational episode in the making of the modern world. Their rivalry helped define the religious, cultural, and political boundaries of Europe and the Middle East. Their legacies continue to inform contemporary discussions about identity, governance, and the meaning of empire in a globalized world. The clash of these titans was not just a matter of territorial ambition, it was a profound struggle over ideas, legitimacy, and the right to shape the future. The confrontation between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires was not merely a geopolitical rivalry. It was a sustained, often brutal struggle that played out on battlefields, in fortified cities, across mountain passes, and upon the waters of the Mediterranean. The intensity of this prolonged conflict reflected not just the ambitions of two vast empires, but also deeper currents of religious, cultural, and economic competition. The 16th century saw this rivalry solidify into military engagements that would not only define their shared borderlands for centuries, but also reverberate throughout the wider world. Key among these were the Siege of Vienna in 1529, the Battle of Mohács in 1526, and the fierce naval confrontations in the Mediterranean. The Battle of Mohács in 1526 was a watershed moment in the Habsburg-Ottoman rivalry. Fought on the fields of southern Hungary, it was not only a dramatic Ottoman triumph, but also a turning point that reshaped the political map of Central Europe. The Ottoman forces, led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, faced off against the army of Louis II of Hungary, a young and inexperienced king who commanded a force numerically and tactically inferior. The battle lasted barely 2 hours, ending in a catastrophic defeat for the Hungarians. Louis II himself perished in the chaos, either drowned in a river while retreating or trampled by his fleeing men. The collapse of the Hungarian monarchy created a dangerous power vacuum that both the Ottomans and Habsburgs rushed to fill. Mohács allowed the Ottomans to gain direct control over central Hungary and establish a long-term military presence in the region. For the Habsburgs, it was a sobering realization of Ottoman might. The death of Louis II, who had no heir, gave the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand of Austria a claim to the Hungarian throne through marriage. But this claim was contested by John Zápolya, a Hungarian noble who aligned himself with the Ottomans. Hungary effectively became split into three zones. Ottoman-controlled Central Hungary, Habsburg-administered Royal Hungary in the west and north, and the semi-autonomous Principality of Transylvania under Ottoman suzerainty. This division would endure for over a century and would ensure that Hungary remained a central theater of conflict between the two powers. With the road into Central Europe now open, Suleiman pressed his advantage, and in 1529 launched a campaign against Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg hereditary lands. The Siege of Vienna in the autumn of that year was the culmination of his military momentum and represented the furthest westward advance of the Ottoman army in Europe. Suleiman's force, composed of tens of thousands of men including elite janissaries, heavy artillery, and Balkan auxiliaries, encountered a city with formidable medieval fortifications but a relatively small defending force. The Viennese defenders, led by Count Nicholas von Somme and reinforced by German mercenaries, braced for a siege that could change the course of European history. Despite the overwhelming size of the Ottoman army, several factors conspired against Suleiman. The heavy rains of the previous weeks had turned roads into mud, slowing the advance of his artillery. Supply lines stretched thin as the army moved deeper into Habsburg territory. Once the siege began, the Ottomans faced determined resistance. The defenders used innovative tactics, including countermining operations that blew up Ottoman tunnels before they could undermine the walls. After several failed assaults and increasing logistical strain, Suleiman lifted the siege and withdrew. Though unsuccessful, the siege sent a chilling message to the courts of Europe. It demonstrated that the Ottoman threat was not limited to the Balkans, but could reach deep into the heart of the continent. For the Habsburgs, Vienna became a symbol of resistance and a rallying point for anti-Ottoman unity. Militarily, the siege revealed both the strengths and limitations of Ottoman logistics and the resilience of Habsburg defenses. Politically, it established a line in the sand. While the Ottomans had shown they could reach Vienna, they also revealed that holding territory so deep within Europe would prove challenging. In the decades that followed, the military engagement between the two empires extended beyond land warfare. The Mediterranean Sea emerged as a vital battleground, where naval supremacy determined control of trade routes, coastal strongholds, and the flow of resources. Here, the conflict expanded to involve other powers as well, especially the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, as well as North African corsair states allied with the Ottomans. The Habsburgs, ruling Spain and thus inheriting its powerful navy, found themselves at the forefront of naval clashes that pitted Christian and Muslim fleets against each other in epic encounters. One of the most iconic naval battles was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Though technically outside the direct Habsburg-Ottoman land rivalry, it involved Spanish Habsburg forces and was emblematic of the maritime front in this imperial conflict. In this engagement, the Holy League, a coalition of Catholic states including Spain, Venice, and the Papal States, confronted the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras off western Greece. It was one of the largest naval battles in history, with hundreds of galleys and tens of thousands of combatants. The Holy League, under the command of Don John of Austria, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V, decisively defeated the Ottoman fleet. The significance of Lepanto was symbolic and strategic. It shattered the myth of Ottoman naval invincibility and reasserted Christian maritime power in the Mediterranean. Although the Ottomans quickly rebuilt their fleet, the psychological blow lingered. For the Habsburgs, Lepanto was a public relations triumph that echoed through Catholic Europe, reinforcing their image as defenders of the faith and protectors of Christendom. Naval warfare between the two empires wasn't limited to grand battles. Smaller skirmishes, pirate raids, and corsair expeditions were routine. The North African coast, under nominal Ottoman control, became a haven for pirates who attacked European shipping and coastal towns. In response, the Habsburgs fortified coastal settlements in Spain and southern Italy and launched punitive expeditions. Control of strategic islands such as Malta, Cyprus, and Crete became flashpoints for conflict. The Knights of Malta, supported by the Habsburgs and other Christian powers, waged a private war against Ottoman shipping, leading to numerous battles at sea. The island of Malta played a critical role in this aspect of the rivalry. In 1565, the Ottomans launched a massive assault on the island, defended by the Knights Hospitaller. The Siege of Malta became a brutal and closely fought campaign. Despite the numerical superiority of the Ottoman forces, the defenders held out with remarkable tenacity, aided eventually by reinforcements from Sicily. The failure to take Malta was another strategic setback for the Ottomans and a morale booster for the Habsburg-led Christian alliance. The struggle between the two empires also took place in a broader diplomatic and psychological theater. Both powers understood the importance of image and propaganda. The Ottomans used their victories to project themselves as the rightful rulers of Islamic lands and the protectors of Muslims under Christian rule. The Habsburgs portrayed themselves as the bulwark against Ottoman expansion and the champions of Christian unity, especially in an era when internal divisions due to the Reformation threatened to fragment Europe. Military encounters, therefore, carried symbolic weight far beyond the battlefield. Victories were celebrated in prints, songs, and sermons. Defeats were rationalized or blamed on betrayal, bad weather, or divine testing. Cities and fortresses became legendary. Vienna, Buda, Mohács, and Lepanto became reference points in the collective memory of each empire, each with their own interpretation of heroism, treachery, and divine will. As the centuries wore on, the nature of the conflict evolved. The Habsburgs, having stabilized their eastern frontier and expanded into Bohemia and northern Italy, increasingly focused on consolidating their domains and managing internal religious tensions. The Ottomans, faced with rebellion, administrative challenges, and the growing threat of Russia and Persia, found their attention divided. Nevertheless, the borderlands in Hungary and the Balkans remained volatile, punctuated by raids, sieges, and seasonal campaigns. In the late 17th century, the confrontation reached a dramatic climax with the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. This renewed Ottoman attempt to take the Habsburg capital, this time led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, assembled a vast coalition of Muslim and Balkan troops. The siege was more methodical than that of 1529, but ultimately met with the same fate. A coalition of Christian forces, including Polish, German, and Austrian troops, broke the siege in a massive battle on the outskirts of the city. The charge led by the Polish King Jan Sobieski became legendary, signaling the beginning of the Ottoman retreat from Central Europe. Following this turning point, the Habsburgs went on the offensive, reclaiming large parts of Hungary and even pushing into the Balkans. The subsequent Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formally ended hostilities and forced the Ottomans to cede substantial territories. This marked a shift in the balance of power. The Habsburgs were now the dominant force in Central Europe, while the Ottomans began a slow but irreversible decline in the region. Even as the direct military confrontations diminished, the memory of these battles continued to shape imperial policies, literature, and identity well into the modern era. The legacy of Mohács, Vienna, and Lepanto endured in the rhetoric of nationalism, the construction of historical narratives, and the drawing of new borders in the 19th and 20th centuries. These conflicts became more than historical episodes. They were transformed into symbols of victory, resilience, and occasionally victimhood, depending on the national context. In retrospect, the battles and sieges that define the Habsburg-Ottoman struggle illustrate the complexity of imperial warfare. It was not merely about conquest or defense. It was about maintaining legitimacy, projecting power, and managing a vast and diverse population. The confrontation was shaped as much by the flow of logistics and supplies as by swords and cannons. Religion was both a motivator and a justification, yet often coexisted with pragmatic alliances, trade, and negotiation. The struggle produced no final victor. Both empires eventually collapsed under the weight of modern nationalism, war, and internal fragmentation. But the centuries of battle left indelible marks on the landscapes, cities, and cultures of Europe and the Middle East. The forts and castles of Hungary, the minarets and churches of the Balkans, the mosaics of Mediterranean ports, and the shared culinary and artistic traditions testify to an era in which two titanic empires fought, negotiated, and coexisted in a complex web of rivalry and interaction. Understanding this long series of battles and sieges is essential to comprehending not only the Habsburg-Ottoman relationship, but also the broader patterns of European and Islamic history. These encounters shaped the development of military technology, fortification techniques, diplomatic protocols, and the very idea of empire. They underscore the enduring truth that borders are not simply lines on a map, but contested zones where ideas, cultures, and powers collide and sometimes, unexpectedly, converge. The 18th century marked a turning point in the long rivalry between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. After centuries of warfare, sieges, pitched battles, and border skirmishes, both powers found themselves reaching exhaustion. The military and financial cost of continuous conflict had taken its toll. Rather than renewed conquests, what followed was a period better characterized by stasis, diplomacy, and shifting alliances. Neither empire was capable of delivering decisive victory over the other. Instead, they turned to negotiation and accommodation as pragmatic means of preserving what remained of their influence. With the frontier between Habsburg and Ottoman realms relatively stable, military campaigns gave way to diplomatic maneuvering, secret treaties, and punctuated periods of peace. Constantinople and Vienna began to rely more on negotiation than cannon fire, engaging in complex diplomatic games designed to maintain retrenchment without total collapse. Each empire hedged its bets through alliances with smaller powers or manipulated rising trends, religious, cultural, or nationalist, to its advantage. The Habsburgs, ruled by Maria Theresa and later Joseph II, reconsolidated power in Hungary, Bohemia, and northern Italy, while cautiously engaging in foreign alliances with France, Britain, and Prussia. The Ottomans, facing internal disorder and financial strain, appealed to European powers, especially France, as counterweights to Habsburg ambitions, playing the grand chessboard of diplomacy to preserve their remaining territorial integrity. Amid this relative calm came the meteoric rise of a third power that would eventually challenge both long-standing empires: Russia. Over the course of the 18th century, under the leadership of Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, Russia transformed itself from a land-bound, agrarian monarchy into a major European power with sea access, modernized armies, and energetic expansionist policies. Peter's victories over Sweden gave Russia control of the Baltic Sea, while Catherine's campaigns in the Caucasus, Crimea, and the Black Sea territories extended Russian reach into lands traditionally influenced by the Ottomans. Russia's ambition came to pose an existential threat not only to Ottoman control of the Black Sea region and the Balkans, but also to Habsburg interests in Central Europe, who now had to account for an increasingly assertive new neighbor. As Russia consolidated Crimea and pushed southward, it forced both empires to re-evaluate their positions. The Ottoman strategy shifted between resistance and accommodation. Successive sultans and viziers attempted to stem Russian gains through defensive war, diplomatic treaties, and reliance on European allies. The Habsburgs, at times wary of Russian expansion threatening their own Balkan territories, saw Russia as both a convenient counter to Ottomans and a possible rival. Behind the scenes, alliances were formed between Habsburgs and Russians, Russians and Ottomans, and occasionally between Ottomans and Habsburgs, each crafted to align temporary interests. Vienna and Moscow signed treaties of mutual defense, but their alliance remained uneasy, built more on common concerns than shared vision. By the end of the 18th century, however, the Ottoman Empire was in visible decline. The factors were manifold. Internally, corruption, incompetent administration, fiscal crisis, and weakening military efficiency eroded its cohesion. Externally, Russia's steady expansion chipped away at Ottoman territory in the Black Sea region and the Caucasus. European intervention, whether diplomatic pressure, naval blockades, or direct military involvement, further disoriented the empire's leadership. The once powerful Ottoman military was repeatedly defeated. Regional governors grew semi-autonomous, while nationalist stirrings in the Balkans began to blossom. These revolts, often sparked by ethno-religious awakening among Greeks, Serbs, Romanians, and others, were as much fueled by the Ottoman Empire's failure to reform as by Russian and Austrian encouragement. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1830, was emblematic of this era. Greece's uprising eventually succeeded in establishing a new nation-state, propelled by strong nationalist sentiment, diplomatic support from Britain, France, and Russia, and political will inside Greece itself. The Habsburgs, following conservative instincts, remained largely aloof. They feared nationalist contagion inside their own multi-ethnic empire. The Ottomans, weakened and isolated, were unable to suppress the uprising decisively. This conflict exemplified how a once expansive empire could be undone not by a foreign conqueror alone, but by internal pressures and loss of legitimacy. Other nationalist movements in the Balkans followed. Serbia, aided by destabilization and sometimes intermittent Russian backing, wrested limited autonomy from Ottoman rule. Romanian principalities Wallachia and Moldavia found themselves subject to Russian protectorate mechanisms, further eroding Ottoman control. By mid-century, the Ottoman Empire had lost most of its European territories, now limited to remnants in Thrace and Albania. During this time, the Habsburgs faced their own nationalist pressures. Their empire, a patchwork of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, and others, struggled to forge a coherent national identity. The revolutionary upheavals of 1848 shook Vienna, and the monarchy was forced to negotiate more autonomy for Hungary and other nationalities. These developments paralleled the broader process in the Balkans, though the Habsburgs, by then Austro-Hungarian, managed to keep their empire intact for decades longer than the Ottomans. Meanwhile, Russia continued to press further south and west. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, pitting a coalition of Britain, France, and the Ottomans against Russia, attempted to curb Russian ambitions in the Black Sea. Though the Ottomans were nominally on the winning side, the conflict exposed their continued military vulnerability and reliance on European power. The war left the empire diplomatically humiliated and financially exhausted, further accelerating territorial losses and administrative breakdown. In the final decades before World War I, the Ottoman Empire increasingly became the object of the so-called Eastern Question: what to do with the crumbling Ottoman state. Habsburg Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, France, and Germany debated, negotiated, and sometimes manipulated Balkan affairs to preserve a balance of power. The Habsburgs feared Ottoman collapse might embolden Pan-Slavists, provoking Russian intervention or Balkan revolt in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina, areas under Habsburg rule that contained large Slavic populations. They often cooperated with the Ottomans to maintain the status quo, if only to prevent the emergence of rival national states. Russia, meanwhile, continued to sponsor Slavic nationalism as a tool of influence. Its wars of liberation against the Ottomans, liberation of Bulgaria after the Russo-Turkish War, 1877–78, and 1903 support for revolutionary groups like the Black Hand in Bosnia reflected a strategic calculus aimed at weakening both Ottoman and Habsburg control in southeastern Europe. Austro-Hungarian officials often feared that Russian meddling would trigger open conflict, even precipitate premature dissolution of their empire. Meanwhile, Ottoman leaders struggled to maintain cohesion through administrative reforms, the Tanzimat, and later constitutional changes, but these came too late to counteract the centrifugal forces unleashed by over a century of decay. By the start of the 20th century, the map of southeastern Europe had been irrevocably reshaped. Independent states had emerged: Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro, Albania. The Habsburg Empire remained standing, but increasingly brittle. The Ottoman realm was reduced to its Anatolian core, parts of the Levant, and Arabian provinces. Both empires found themselves drawn into the Great War by 1914, Austria-Hungary on the side of Germany, the Ottomans later joining the Central Powers, and each collapsed within 4 years. The 18th and 19th centuries thus witnessed a profound shift in the balance of power. What had once been a binary rivalry, a centuries-long struggle for borderlands, became a more complex multipolar competition involving diplomacy, shifting alliances, and the emergence of new actors. The Habsburgs and Ottomans, once locked in existential combat, found themselves enfeebled by internal division, nationalist revolt, and external pressure. Amid this transformation, Russia emerged as a decisive force, displacing Ottoman dominance in Eastern Europe and threatening Habsburg stability. This shift reshaped geopolitics. Traditional empire-for-empire confrontation gave way to alliances layered with strategic ambiguity. Empires sought to preserve what remained through adroit diplomacy, playing rival powers against each other. Russia leveraged ethnic ties and Orthodox Christianity to extend its influence. Britain, France, and Germany each found reasons to engage in Russo-Habsburg-Ottoman affairs, whether to preserve the Ottoman buffer, to temper Russian expansion, or to check Habsburg power. By the late 19th century, the declining Ottoman state came to symbolize the failure of traditional imperial structures to adapt in a modernizing world. Its collapse provided both a cautionary tale and a geopolitical opportunity for other powers. The region descended into instability and conflict. The Balkan Wars of 1912–13 shattered what remained of Ottoman territories in Europe and left Austro-Hungary isolated and alarmed. Nationalist politics and territorial disputes lit the fuse that would explode in 1914. In the broader sweep of history, the 18th century stalemate and 19th century decline demonstrate how empire cannot survive solely by might and tradition. The Habsburg and Ottoman cases each suggest that what preserves empire in peace must reform as profoundly as what wins in war. Failing to do so leaves structures brittle, prone to fracture when pressures mount. The emergence of Russia armed with modernized forces, nationalist ideology, and ambitious rulers presented the final push that fractured the old order. The shift in power reflected deeper global transformations. The rise of modern nationalism, the spread of industrialized warfare, and the growing influence of great power intervention in regions once dominated by imperial incumbents. The former rivals, the Habsburgs and Ottomans, ended not through conquest by each other, but because they could no longer reconcile the demands of governance, reform, and identity within their traditional imperial frameworks. Their decline opened the way for successor states whose own struggles to define nationhood would bring Europe into a new and darker age. The conflict between the Habsburgs and Ottomans shaped Europe and the surrounding regions in ways that continue to resonate today. Their rivalry did more than determine who held which territory. It forged national identities, influenced cultures, and left a deep imprint on the political and social fabric of Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Middle East. In Central Europe, the centuries of Ottoman pressure forced Habsburg rulers to develop more centralized and militarized states. The need to defend against incursions led to reforms in administration, infrastructure, and military organization, laying foundations for later nation-states like Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The ideologies of Christendom and resistance to Ottoman Islam permeated cultural narratives, helping shape a collective European identity during and after the Reformation. In the Balkans, their struggles nurtured complex, multi-layered identities. Populations lived under Ottoman rule for centuries, exposing them to Islam, Sharia law, militant institutions, Ottoman Turkish language, Ottoman architecture, cuisine, and administrative systems. That shared experience, combined with later Habsburg rule in areas like Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Vojvodina, introduced Central European legal systems, Catholicism, Baroque art, language reforms, and bureaucratic institutions. Thus, Balkan states today, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, Greece, Croatia, Slovenia carry traces of both legacies in their national myths, legal traditions, religious diversity, cuisine, music, and cityscapes. In the Middle East, Ottoman rule consolidated diverse communities rather than impose uniformity. The millet system allowed Christian and Jewish communities to live under their own laws and leaders. Ottoman infrastructure investments shaped transportation, trade, and communication networks. Even though the empire eventually failed to modernize, its legal reforms, Tanzimat, and late 19th century centralization efforts left a mixed legacy in emerging nation-states Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, where the interplay of imperial structures and Western mandates molded modern governance systems. Politically, Ottoman and Habsburg rule fostered religious pluralism in multinational empires, but also left fragile seeds of division. The millet model and differential rights for religious groups that Ottoman society embraced underpinned modern Balkan pluralism and persistent sectarian tensions. Habsburg attempts to integrate Slavs and Magyars under a German-dominated monarchy ultimately fueled nationalism and ethnic demands. Both empires, to preserve power, negotiated identities and boundaries journaled through shifting alliances, linguistic reforms, codified rights, and centralized administration, yet the uneven integration they achieved contributed to 20th century conflicts. Economic patterns in the Balkans and Eastern Europe also bear their influence. Ottoman land tenure systems like the Timar shaped agricultural structures, based on subsistence farming long after formal Ottoman control ended. Habsburg lands, by contrast, featured early railroads, industrial towns, and commercial agriculture, influencing uneven development in the region. This pulled some Balkan areas into Habsburg-style capitalist networks, while others remained peripheral and agrarian. Architecturally and culturally, the rivalry produced a hybrid legacy. Ottoman mosques, bazaars, baths, and fortresses remained central features of cities like Sarajevo, Thessaloniki, and Shkodër. Baroque palaces, imperial squares, and Gothic Renaissance churches testify to Habsburg influence across Central Europe and parts of the Adriatic coast. Linguistically, Ottoman Turkish gave way, but left loanwords in Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian, Albanian, and Greek. Habsburg German and Hungarian bureaucratic terminology also became embedded in regional languages and legal codes. Religiously, this rivalry shaped the demography of modern states. The conversions to Islam within Ottoman lands and the confessional policies of the Habsburgs, Counter-Reformation, religious toleration edicts, shifting legal regimes, explain today's mix of Orthodox, Islamic, Catholic, and Protestant communities often concentrated along fault lines inherited from imperial borders. On an international level, the century-long Habsburg-Ottoman struggle influenced broader European geopolitics. It dictated alliances. France allied with Ottoman Turkey to balance Habsburg dominance, while Britain and Russia later navigated Ottoman decline to pursue their own interests. The creation of the Eastern Question in the 19th century hinged on how Europe would handle the unraveling Ottoman order. This question influenced diplomacy leading up to World War I, and its legacy persists in debates over intervention in nations facing declining or fragile states. The intellectual legacy also remains. Portraits of heroic resistance against the Ottomans figure in Habsburg-era histories. Ottoman historiography likewise celebrates conquest and religious authority. Both frameworks inform modern national mythmaking. Legal traditions, codified laws, and administrative systems across former imperial territories still reflect structures introduced under imperial rule. Today's institutions, constitutions, parliaments, property rights, municipal governance trace their roots in imperial experiments. Even tensions over minorities, autonomy, and language policy mirror deals struck under Ottoman millet arrangements and Habsburg nationality laws. Former imperial sites serve as museums and tourist attractions, reminding locals and visitors of how layered the historical palimpsest is. In the global narrative, the Habsburg-Ottoman rivalry illuminates how empires define each other and how power limits and enables identity formation. The long borderlands witnessed cultural exchange, crafts, music, attire, medicine, as well as conflict. This borderland experience complicates simplistic East-West dichotomies and encourages appreciation for the entangled histories of modern Europe and the Middle East. The history of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires is often told through the lens of rivalry, centuries of war, sieges, and territorial disputes. However, beneath that overarching narrative lies a deeper, more nuanced relationship that also featured periods of intense cooperation, mutual dependence, and significant cultural exchange. While they were geopolitical adversaries, they were also neighbors with overlapping interests, trade networks, and complex diplomatic relationships. The evolution of their interdependence is not only critical for understanding their past, but also helps explain many aspects of the modern states that have emerged from their former territories. Despite the antagonism on the battlefield, trade between the Habsburg and Ottoman territories flourished. This was not a mere accident or the result of rogue merchants defying political orders. It was a conscious decision by both imperial administrations to facilitate commerce even in times of military tension. The Ottoman Empire, with its strategic control over key routes linking Europe with Asia and Africa, served as an indispensable node in early modern trade networks. Meanwhile, the Habsburg Empire, with its connections to the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Central Europe, offered valuable goods and access to Western European markets. Both empires recognized that while they might compete militarily, their economic interests often aligned. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this trade was formalized through a series of agreements known as capitulations, which granted foreign merchants special privileges within Ottoman territory. These agreements weren't limited to Western European powers like France and Venice. The Habsburgs also negotiated favorable terms for their merchants. Goods such as textiles, spices, metals, timber, grains, and luxury items flowed across the borderlands. Ottoman merchants operated in Habsburg lands, and vice versa, contributing to a vibrant economic zone that straddled imperial borders. While smuggling and informal trade were widespread, they were often tolerated by authorities who understood their economic utility. Beyond trade, the two empires maintained intricate diplomatic ties. These were not merely channels for negotiating ceasefires or exchanging hostages. They were long-term relationships featuring embassies, envoys, and even moments of mutual assistance. The Treaty of Slovakia in 1606 marked a turning point by establishing the Habsburg Emperor and the Ottoman Sultan as equals, a significant diplomatic shift that signaled a normalization of relations rather than pure antagonism. Regular diplomatic missions ensued, including the exchange of gifts, letters, and envoys, which helped create an understanding between the courts in Vienna and Istanbul. In this framework of diplomacy, pragmatism often prevailed over ideology. Both courts understood that perpetual warfare was unsustainable and that coexistence required carefully negotiated boundaries and agreements. Religion, far from being a simple dividing line between the Christian Habsburgs and Muslim Ottomans, also became a site of surprising complexity and exchange. Both empires ruled over multi-ethnic, multi-religious populations. The Habsburgs, especially as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, oversaw a patchwork of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christian territories. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire governed large Christian populations in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, as well as Jews, Armenians, and other religious minorities. Religious tolerance, while often limited and politically motivated, allowed for the coexistence of diverse communities within both empires. The Ottomans employed the millet system, which granted autonomy to religious communities, allowing them to manage their own affairs in matters like marriage, education, and worship. This system created a kind of pluralism that contrasted with the more rigid religious structures of some Catholic Habsburg lands, particularly during the Counter-Reformation. However, even within the Habsburg domain, religious minorities such as Jews and Orthodox Christians managed to carve out spaces of relative autonomy, especially in urban centers and borderlands. Cultural and intellectual exchange followed these patterns of coexistence. Ottoman architectural styles influenced buildings in southeastern Europe, while Baroque and Renaissance aesthetics found their way into cities like Istanbul and Edirne through European artisans and craftsmen working for Ottoman patrons. Books, medical knowledge, artistic techniques, and even culinary practices moved between the two worlds, challenging the notion of completely separate civilizational spheres. Coffee, for example, entered Central Europe through Ottoman influence, becoming a central feature of Viennese culture. Musical instruments and motifs also crossed imperial lines, blending folk traditions from Anatolia, the Balkans, and Central Europe into hybrid forms that persist today. At the personal level, there were cross-border communities, merchants, diplomats, translators, and religious leaders who acted as cultural intermediaries. These go-betweens facilitated not only commerce and diplomacy, but also cultural understanding. They helped translate legal documents, interpreted during negotiations, and explained local customs to foreign courts. Their roles were essential in navigating the complex, multilingual, and multicultural landscapes that both empires encompassed. In many ways, the Habsburgs and Ottomans were mirrors of one another. Both faced the challenge of governing sprawling, diverse populations. Both had to manage internal dissent, regional autonomy, and the pressures of modernization. And both, despite their rivalry, looked across their shared borders and saw not only a threat, but also an example, a competing model of empire that offered lessons and warnings. By the 19th century, as nationalist movements began to fracture imperial cohesion, both empires found themselves dealing with similar problems. How to integrate diverse populations into a centralized state, how to reform legal and administrative systems, and how to compete with the rising powers of Britain, France, and Russia. The Ottomans implemented the Tanzimat reforms, modernizing their legal code, military, and bureaucracy. The Habsburgs responded with their own reforms, culminating in the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which attempted to balance competing ethnic and regional demands within a dual monarchy. Even in decline, the two empires continued to interact and influence each other. As nationalist revolts broke out in the Balkans, both Vienna and Istanbul sought to manage the fallout. Sometimes they cooperated to suppress uprisings. Other times they competed for influence over newly forming nation-states. The tangled diplomacy surrounding Serbia, Bosnia, and other Balkan territories reflected not only geopolitical maneuvering, but also a shared investment in managing the instability of imperial fragmentation. The legacy of this interdependence continues to shape the modern world. Many of today's political borders, religious distributions, and ethnic tensions in the Balkans, Central Europe, and the Middle East are products of imperial legacies shaped by both conflict and cooperation. Countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, still reflect the religious and cultural pluralism fostered under both Habsburg and Ottoman rule. The presence of mosques, Catholic churches, Orthodox cathedrals, and synagogues in a single cityscape is a direct inheritance of this shared past. In Turkey and Austria, the empires are remembered in complex ways, both with pride and ambivalence. In Austria, the Habsburg legacy is central to national identity, yet its imperial past also raises questions about multiculturalism and nationalism. In Turkey, the Ottoman past is increasingly celebrated, though interpretations vary between secular and Islamic narratives. Both countries also grapple with the histories of regions they once ruled, how to acknowledge a shared past without reopening old wounds. In the broader European and Middle Eastern context, understanding the cooperative aspects of the Habsburg-Ottoman relationship offers a powerful counter-narrative to civilizational conflict. It reveals that even the most entrenched rivals can engage in mutual exchange, peaceful coexistence, and productive interdependence. It challenges simplistic divisions between East and West, Christianity and Islam, and Europe and the Middle East. Their relationship was defined not by a single dimension, but by a spectrum of interaction from war to diplomacy, from hostility to trade, from religious exclusivity to cultural exchange. This shared history, deeply embedded in the institutions, languages, religions, and identities of millions of people, remains a crucial part of the story of both empires and the modern nations that succeeded them. Understanding it not only enriches our view of the past, but also provides insights into the possibilities of peaceful coexistence in the future. The history of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires is a vast and intricate tapestry woven over centuries of conflict, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and mutual influence. Their legacies extend far beyond the battlefields on which they met or the treaties they signed. They shaped the political, religious, and cultural fabric of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of North Africa in profound and lasting ways. To understand the world as it is today, particularly the geopolitical dynamics of Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean, it is necessary to understand the complicated relationship between these two imperial powers. From their respective rises in the late Middle Ages, the Habsburgs and Ottomans were destined to engage. Both expanded rapidly, and their spheres of influence inevitably overlapped in contested regions such as Hungary, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Their conflicts were not merely about territory, they were symbolic, ideological, and religious. The Christian Habsburg Empire and the Muslim Ottoman Empire often saw themselves as defenders of their respective faiths. However, this binary view conceals a far more complicated reality. Both empires were profoundly multicultural and multireligious. Both had to rule over populations that did not always share their religion, language, or customs. Both had to develop administrative structures capable of managing diversity, integrating elites, and maintaining cohesion in vast and decentralized domains. Wars such as the Battle of Mohács, the Sieges of Vienna, and the long Habsburg-Ottoman Wars over Hungary dominate the historical narrative. These moments were undoubtedly dramatic and pivotal. They shifted borders, determined dynastic fates, and reshaped alliances. Yet, it is not the wars alone that define the legacy of these empires. It is also their resilience, adaptability, and the ways they interacted outside the theater of war. They traded with each other, even during periods of conflict. They sent envoys and negotiated peace treaties that often lasted decades. They borrowed architectural styles, adopted new administrative practices, and influenced one another's courtly cultures. Indeed, the very nature of imperial power is brought into sharp relief by studying these two empires. Neither the Habsburgs nor the Ottomans ruled monolithic, unified states in the modern sense. Their governance depended on a delicate balance of power sharing, local autonomy, and bureaucratic oversight. They had to accommodate different legal systems, religious authorities, and regional identities. In doing so, they developed mechanisms of control and integration that continue to influence political structures today. The millet system of the Ottomans and the complex estates and diets of the Habsburgs demonstrate early forms of pluralistic governance, which, although imperfect and often hierarchical, provided models for dealing with diversity that continue to inform political thought. Their eventual decline, while often romanticized or viewed as inevitable, was neither sudden nor simple. Both empires endured long after they ceased to expand. Their decline was not just the result of external pressure, though that played a role, but also internal strains. Economic transformations, rising nationalism, the challenges of modernization, and the shift from agrarian to industrial economies. As they lost territory and influence, both tried to reform themselves, sometimes successfully, often unsuccessfully. Their attempts to adapt to rework laws, centralize administration, and modernize military forces show the difficulty of balancing tradition with the demands of a changing world. The fall of these empires in the early 20th century did not erase their influence. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense redefinition. New nation-states arose from their former territories, often drawing boundaries that reflected imperial legacies more than coherent ethnic or cultural divisions. The modern Balkans, Central Europe, and parts of the Middle East are still shaped by the borders, conflicts, and administrative practices of these empires. Religious communities that coexisted under imperial rule found themselves in new national contexts, sometimes welcomed, often marginalized. The legacy of imperial rule can be seen in the architecture of cities, the language of law codes, and even the composition of parliaments and bureaucracies. The persistence of cultural and religious diversity in these regions is itself a testament to the imperial past. In cities like Sarajevo, Istanbul, Vienna, and Budapest, one still finds traces of the coexistence that defined Ottoman and Habsburg rule. Mosques, churches, synagogues, and palaces stand not just as historical artifacts, but as living reminders of a time when empires governed people not by erasing difference, but by managing it however imperfectly. Of course, this coexistence was often fraught, and imperial tolerance had its limits. Yet it also allowed for the flourishing of diverse traditions, the mixing of languages, and the sharing of ideas. In studying the intertwined histories of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, we also gain insight into the long arc of globalization. These empires were among the first truly transregional powers, with networks that spanned continents and connected distant peoples. The trade routes they protected and the wars they fought shaped the flow of goods, people, and ideas across Eurasia and North Africa. Their courts welcomed foreign diplomats, their cities hosted international merchants, and their institutions absorbed influences from both East and West. In this way, they prefigured the interconnected world we now inhabit. The lessons from their histories are especially relevant today. In a time when national borders and identities are once again sources of conflict, when pluralism is both a strength and a challenge, the experiences of these empires offer models both positive and negative of how large, diverse societies can function. They show us that identity is not static, that cultures are not isolated, and that cooperation is possible even in the midst of rivalry. They remind us that history is rarely linear. Empires rise and fall, but their legacies endure in ways that continue to shape how we understand power, community, and change. Furthermore, the comparison between these two empires challenges simplistic narratives of East versus West or Islam versus Christianity. Their relationship was not one of pure antagonism. It was also one of mutual curiosity, negotiation, and exchange. At times, the Habsburgs allied with the Ottomans to counterbalance other European rivals. At other times, Ottoman leaders admired European innovations and adopted them into their own systems. This complexity defies reductionist explanations and instead demands a nuanced understanding of how civilizations interact. In reflecting on the broader human experience, the histories of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires invite us to consider the enduring tension between unity and diversity, centralization and local autonomy, tradition and reform. They were not perfect empires. They could be oppressive, rigid, and exploitative. But they were also sites of extraordinary cultural creativity, political experimentation, and social negotiation. They demonstrated the possibilities and limits of empire as a form of political organization and as a mode of human coexistence. For scholars, policymakers, and anyone interested in the roots of the modern world, the study of these empires is not merely an academic exercise. It is a means of understanding how deeply the past informs the present. Issues like ethnic conflict, religious pluralism, bureaucratic governance, and regional identity cannot be fully grasped without reference to the imperial histories that shaped them. By analyzing how the Habsburgs and Ottomans ruled, adapted, and ultimately collapsed, we gain insight into the fragility and resilience of complex political systems. The intertwined destinies of these two empires also reveal how history resists neat endings. Though their political structures have long since disappeared, the echoes of their presence remain visible in the streets of European and Middle Eastern cities, in the laws and institutions of successor states, and in the memories and identities of the people who once lived under their rule. Whether in the continuing tensions in the Balkans, the cultural blending of southeastern Europe, or the symbolic power of imperial architecture, the legacy of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires continues to shape our world. The story of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires is not just a tale of empires long gone. It is a narrative of how two powerful civilizations interacted, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through cooperation, and how their engagement shaped the contours of the modern world. Their experiences offer enduring lessons about the complexities of governance, the possibilities of coexistence, and the need to understand history not as a series of isolated events, but as a continuum that connects past, present, and future. As we face global challenges that echo the dilemmas of the imperial age, questions of identity, diversity, conflict, and cooperation, there is much to learn from their shared and contested legacy.